Despite what many people have characterized as the great moderation, business cycles are alive and well. Since 2008, we've all been aware of that. So this paper is really about business cycles and fiscal policy, and to the extent that fiscal rules can help stabilize fiscal policy to be less pro-cyclical than it traditionally has been. So just to start the discussion, I've put a list of countries here in our data set where we've looked at 1984 through 2012. And we've taken an HP filter on GDP and asked how large are the business cycles over this whole period of time, and then ranked countries from low to high, and then color-coded depending on whether they're advanced economies, that is the black, emerging markets, red, or green being developing economies. And you can see that the great majority of countries in this very high amplitude of business cycles are in fact developing economies. So continuing that discussion, this is very simple, taking detrended, the cyclical component of fiscal policy, particularly and specifically expenditures, and looking at GDP, cyclical component, and doing country by country regressions to see to what extent are they pro-cyclical, no correlation, or counter-cyclical. Where negative means counter-cyclical values here. Again, we've ranked them from counter-cyclical all the way to very pro-cyclical, and that's 0. And again, the color coding's the same. So what you see is there's a group of countries that show very counter-cyclical fiscal policies, but the majority of countries, particularly developing economies, you see are very pro-cyclical. So that sort of sets up the question that we're addressing in this paper: to what extent can fiscal rules? We know that, and pardon me while I'm talking, and I'm going to skip all the way back to the beginning of the presentation because I just decided to put these up to motivate it here. We've talked about inflation targeting today. We've talked about monetary rules, Taylor rules. We've spoken all about monetary policy, but with respect to fiscal policy, there is literally a dearth of serious analysis on how effective are fiscal rules. Now, whenever I'm speaking about fiscal policy, comparing it to monetary policy, fiscal policy by its nature is a much more complicated animal. It varies in so many different dimensions relative to monetary policy. And of course, monetary policy is complicated. So developing fiscal rules that actually are effective in reducing the cyclicality of fiscal policy, in principle, is quite complicated. So in this paper then, we're going to look at national fiscal rules, and which is relative little systematic effectiveness of fiscal rules, and much of that's focused on Europe. Europe, as we all know, has had a number, of course, national fiscal rules, but the focus has been on supranational fiscal rules. That is the Maastricht Treaty growth and stability mechanism, and which has utterly failed. And right now, European institutions are in the process of building new sets of rules, which hopefully will be effective for the next major crisis, once we're over the current major crisis. In any case, the question is, are rules only applicable to advanced economies, or are they equally well to emerging developing economies? And I'll say that the IMF certainly thinks so, because in their policy advice, they're focusing, I won't say focusing, but now fiscal rules are an element of that. They've developed databases on fiscal rules, comprehensive databases on this, which of course allows us to study it as well, using those databases. So the objective is, are fiscal rules effective in moving policies towards counter-cyclical? So there's lots of different reasons for rules. One may be for sustainability of policies over a long term, keeping debt ratios low, keeping primary balances, surpluses over a cycle, structural balance, for example. We're focused on a much narrower question, simply cyclicality, because pro-cyclical fiscal policy has the possibility of making the business cycle amplitudes larger, while counter-cyclical, working well, can reduce the amplitude of business cycles. So that's what we're doing. And our strategy here is to use data on fiscal rules to test whether stronger fiscal rules reduce that procyclicality over time and across countries, and in particular controlling for a variety of factors, but particularly government efficiency. And I'll talk about what I mean by that in a moment here. Now, Chile, there's been a lot of work on Chile. I'm not quite sure, maybe Josh can answer this for me, but there's a lot of very talented Chilean economists. And I think there's a direct correlation between how messed up your economy is and how many great economists you generate. Because, I mean, Chile obviously is doing quite well, or relatively well now, but still historically, when there's major problems in the economy, it generates intellectual interest and public service by very talented people. And economics, I think, attracts that. In any case, a lot of people have studied Chile, partly because of all the problems they've had, but they've set up in Chile a fiscal rule which has apparently been extraordinarily effective. And there's been a lot of work on that. And in particularly, these writers, Frankel, Vey, and Bulletin, have argued that Chile and a number of other Latin American countries have graduated, as they call it, graduated from pro-cyclical to counter-cyclical policies. And that's greatly helped stabilize these economies. I won't go into the detail of that rule. And by the way, just before I continue, I've looked at recently on the data, IMF data set that we're focusing on India. And correct me if I'm wrong, or I should say correct IMF data set if I'm wrong, if it's wrong, but it only identifies for any national fiscal rules in India as under the 2004 to 2008 period and essentially abandoned in 2009. So if you actually look at the Indian part of the IMF data set, that's the only period of which they saw rules implemented, and if you actually look at the implementation, they have rather weak characteristics, according to that data set. In any case, I've talked about the graduation of fiscal policy. Cyclicality, this paper, Izaki and Vey, has shown, or in both these studies, have shown that the nature of fiscal cyclicality has changed, and in fact, over time, emerging markets in particular have become less pro-cyclical. Several studies have focused on the quality of institutions, have not focused on rules at all. In fact, neither of these studies have looked at rules. They've just primarily looked at the quality of institutions, how that's really important to essentially macro stability. There have been some studies on rules, which I address here, and in the paper more in detail, but much of that's been focused on Europe, particularly with the failure of Maastricht in that respect, Stability and Growth Pact. So our contribution here is to construct some new indices based on this underlying fiscal affairs data set put together by the IMF group there, which covers 81 countries over this period, but it's advanced, emerging, developing. And we combine that with government efficiency, and then we focus on the procyclicality element there. Now, just a few words on the data set itself. The IMF has an aggregate index, but it's unpublished. So we go through all their numbers and develop our own data set for this, which varies by year, by country, over time. So this is the data set period of time. Now, just to give you a quick overview of it, there's 4 types of rules they look at: budget balance rules, debt rules, expenditure rules, and revenue rules, of which there's 5 characteristics for each type of rule. You know, how is it monitored? How is it enforced? What's the coverage, the legal basis, escape clauses? And so we look at those 20 categories, as well as several other institutional arrangements, supporting procedures institution, For example, some countries have fiscal councils that monitor, sort of like a monetary council, but it's a fiscal council that monitor the rules, how they're being used. Sweden, my co-author is a gentleman from Sweden, and he used to be on this fiscal council, so he has a great deal of interest in how they work, not just in Sweden, but internationally. So together we look at these 20 characteristics plus these other 8 we identify and use a total of 28. And some of these are binary, some are continuous, but we do a standardization procedure to put them together to try to get an index of fiscal strength, that is, fiscal rule strength. We did another paper using the European Commission's data set. We did this actually for the European Commission initially. And we've compared data sets that the European Union has put together, or European Commission, and the IMF, and they're quite highly correlated. So these are not, they do differ in terms of coverage. The fiscal data set of the IMF is only on the national level, while the European Union one, which only covers European countries, by the way, European Union members, it also looks at local and regional governments. Okay, so government efficiency, we're looking at a World Bank indicator there. There's a number of different political economy variables one can look at. We're pretty straightforward here and look at government efficiency indicator, which reflects, using the World Bank, perceptions of the quality of public services, the quality of civil service, and the degree of independence from political pressures, the quality of policy formulation, implementation, and the credibility of the government's commitment to such policies. So obviously that's a very, that's a long paragraph to begin with, but there's a lot of different concepts there. And if you actually find out how they get it, how they measure it, it's impossible. There's no general characterization, because they look at, in their quotes here, large number of enterprise, citizen, and expert survey respondents, industrial and developing economies. They look at survey institutes, think tanks, non-governmental organizations, international organizations, private sector firms. So basically this is about the broadest measure, but at the same time, I think it's probably the most eclectic and probably best measure of government efficiency. So they've actually used some judgment in putting this together rather than simple mechanical element there. But be that as it may, my guess is that whatever measure you use, they're very similar. Okay, now in terms of cyclical fiscal policy, so remember we have rules, we have government efficiency, we're interested in how that impacts the cyclicality of fiscal policy. So how do you measure the cyclicality of fiscal policy? I already showed you, summary statistic on it through the graphical means, but what we're doing essentially is looking at real government expenditure. Tax rates may also measure cyclicality, but the tax rate indicators are really not available for a broad group of countries over time. So we and other people in this literature focus on real government expenditures, which are in this case cyclically adjusted. We also look at percent change as opposed to cyclical adjusted HP filters. But this follows the literature, and these two different measures give very similar results. Okay, so here's sort of the model to think about it here. We have cyclical government expenditure and lagged, so it's a dynamic panel we're looking at. We're looking at a panel over all these 81 countries. Here's GDP, so that measures cyclicality with GDP, but the interaction term, GDP, this tells you how, given some cyclicality, how is it modified with national fiscal rules. So this tells you a strength indicator. So this interaction term combined with this will give you the net effect. So this tells you the marginal effect of fiscal rules, this tells now. But in addition, once you put in a government efficiency, then you want this element here, government efficiency, also interactive effect. But with respect to rules, it could well be the case that rules are really only effective when complemented with high levels of government efficiency. So what's a rule without a government to implement it or monitor it or take it seriously, essentially? So those three elements there, this, and this, are really what we're focusing on in this paper. Okay, we have a dynamic panel with fist effects, really on bond, one-step GMM difference estimator. GDP is considered endogenous. I'm going to report clustered standard, robust standard errors. Just a technical note, doing GMM on this stuff is a panel like this is difficult because you get all these instruments, and it's a sort of a judgment in the literature of how you reduce the number of instruments to a manageable. We're following Rudman in this case, and his suggestions reducing the number of instruments in the GMM estimation process. So going back to the empirical data here, just look at national fiscal rules, that's this here, and look how popular they've become over time. So on average, this is just the number, average number in the sample, and what you see is that fiscal rules have become very popular. So sometimes they come, sometimes they go, like the data I had on India from the IMF data set suggested it was implemented between 2004 and 2008, which is not unusual. If you look at countries like the United States, we had fairly strong fiscal rules at some time, then they were allowed to lapse, and other times we have implemented other forms of fiscal rules. Okay, now just to give you an example of the size of these things, now our fiscal rule index, that's the way we've designed it, goes from 0 to 2. And it turns out the strongest fiscal rules in our sample here happen to be the United Kingdom. Chile, which is this red line, has strong fiscal rules by the average of the sample, but still much less, much weaker than some countries. By the way, that was, when I presented to some Chilean economists, they took great exception to that because they said you can't have stronger fiscal rules than Chile does. But where they fall down is on the monitoring, the legal basis, and some of these other enforcement issues, not just the rule itself. In any case, you can see the variation over time and across countries. Okay, just a summary statistic here, though. Now just, again, looking country by country, looking at all these 81 time series, and ask yourself, we measured the cyclicality of fiscal policy. I showed you that in our chart. So take that measure, going from a negative number, -2 here, to the sample is above 3, and ask yourself, what about the rules? To what extent is it correlated with the fiscal rule index? And so what you find is that stronger fiscal rules are associated with lower cyclicality. And the stronger fiscal rules are associated with negative fiscality. Now, if you do the interaction, so if you look here on this side, this is the same, but now look at national fiscal rules interacted with government efficiency. So you can say it's, again, higher, the combination of higher fiscal rules and government efficiency gives you much less fiscal cyclicality. Okay, so that's the basic statistical outline. If you're actually looking at some estimates here, we've got very highly significant coefficients for those joint interaction term. If you think of this as procyclicality norm, but with the interaction terms here, it shows that these can greatly reduce cyclicality if you have higher levels of national fiscal rules and government efficiency. So putting that into sort of an economic terms, what does it mean? So what we've done here is just take an average government efficiency. So basically what we're doing is simply taking different values of GE here. We have an average, and then for the whole sample, then we take an average for the highest quintile. And then multiply it by national fiscal rules to see how it varies over time. So we're controlling for government efficiency. So here's average government efficiency, here's high government efficiencies, here's national fiscal rules, and what we've done is measure the net cyclicality based on the degree of level of national fiscal rules. And the point being here, if this is zero fiscality, that you really need to have a very high fiscal rule index, very strong fiscal rules, if you've got average government efficiency. It's very difficult to get acyclicality out of that. By contrast, you have high government efficiency, then you can achieve that objective, zero cyclicality, with fairly low degree of fiscal rules here. So government efficiency is very important, is the first point here. Now, the people in political science argue that measures of government efficiency are not very nuanced. It's very difficult to distinguish between countries on this sort of relatively crude measure. And several have studied that it's better to cluster countries. That is, rather than trying to make a fine distinction among them, cluster them and essentially run a robust set of regressions for robustness. And that's what we do. So we cluster them into high, good, moderate, and low, and run the regressions. And now I'm going to show you the results again. Empirically, we find significant results again. So that's the interaction term when you have high government efficiency. That's what it is when you have good government efficiency. So moving from there to there gives you much more countercyclicality. So going from moderate government efficiency and high government efficiency, I'll go through that same experiment that I did last time, and you get a very similar result. That acyclicality, if you have just moderate government efficiency, is achieved when you have quite strong fiscal rules. So that's above 1, which is our sample average is about 0.5, so that's well above that. By contrast, you have high government efficiency. You have fiscal rules of just the sample mean or average fiscal rules will give you that acyclicality. Okay, so that's basically the primary results of the paper. We've looked at a variety of robustness tests, different ways of measuring cyclicality, looking at some separate regressions for developing economies. To simply reiterate this and to say something about our research in this area. So we're going beyond, noticing that the bulk of the largest business cycle amplitudes are in developing economies, and that also the great bulk of procyclical fiscal policies are in developing economies. The next phase of our work, which is undergoing now, is to focus more on the distinctions between advanced, emerging, and developing. And in this context, we get similar results, but we've already, in some sense, already said that. We know generally, we've already had a bit of a precursor to these results, because already we know that developing economies, for the most part, have relatively low government efficiency. And we've already found that government efficiency is really important for the enforcement, monitoring, and essentially effectiveness of rules. So in one sense, when you're studying developing economies, we've already done that by looking at the distinction, which is clear between advanced and developing on the basis. Now, I just want to point out one thing about emerging markets. First of all, I found out that India is focused right here on the cyclicality. I'm not quite sure why this is, but perhaps people in the room can tell me. We see relatively little cyclicality of fiscal policy in India, measured by government expenditure. And overall, for many emerging markets, now they're the red of the emerging markets, there's a number of countries here, but they don't seem to be different in terms of cyclicality than advanced economies. So the real issue of research and understanding more in this area is to focus on this gang, this group here, where you really see very strong pro-cyclical policies in developing economies.